My name is Reese Holt and I was 34 years old, sitting in the conference room of an estate attorney's office on a Wednesday morning in January, when my father-in-law walked in with a man I did not recognize carrying a leather briefcase. The man with the briefcase was an attorney. I understood this before anyone said it. The specific way he set his briefcase on the table and opened it without looking at anyone in the room was the way of someone who has been brought to a place to do a job and is already doing it. My father-in-law, Edward Holt, was 69. He sat across from me with the specific stillness of a man who has decided how a situation is going to go and is waiting for the room to catch up. He had driven 4 hours. He had brought a lawyer. He had not called me before he came. My husband James had been dead for 11 weeks. The estate attorney, a woman named Sylvia Park, looked at the man with the briefcase. She looked at Edward. She looked at me. She said, "For the record, who is accompanying Mr. Holt today?" The man said his name was Gerald Marsh and that he represented the interests of Edward Holt in matters relating to the estate of James Holt. Sylvia looked at her folder. She said, "I see." Then she opened the folder and she said, "Before we begin, I need to share something with everyone in this room." She slid 2 documents across the table, one toward Edward and Gerald Marsh, one toward me. I looked at mine. I knew what it was before I read it. James had told me about it 11 months before he died, on a Sunday afternoon in the garden. In the specific way he told me things he had been thinking about carefully for a long time. He had not made it dramatic. He had simply described what he had done and why, and then he had asked me if I had questions and I had asked who, and he had answered them, and we had gone back to the garden. Edward looked at his copy. His expression moved through several things in the space of about 4 seconds. I watched all of them. Gerald Marsh leaned over and read quietly beside him. The room was very still. "Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments." I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Not to the conference room, not to the briefcase. Further back, to a man who understood the difference between what he had built and what he wanted to leave behind, and who had spent the last year of his life making sure those 2 things were the same. My husband James Holt was 37 when he died. He was a software engineer who had spent 8 years building a data security company from a 2-person startup in a rented office above a dry cleaner to a firm with 40 employees and a client list that included several companies you would recognize. He had sold a majority stake to a private equity group 3 years before his death, retaining a meaningful minority position and a consulting role that let him stay involved without the weight of day-to-day operations. The sale had been transformative financially. James had handled it with the same quality he brought to everything, which was a combination of precision and patience that made the people around him feel that decisions were being made correctly rather than quickly. He had been diagnosed with a brain tumor in February of the year before he died, grade 4, the specific kind that does not negotiate. His oncologist had used words like aggressive and expedited, and James had listened to all of them and then asked 3 questions about the timeline and then driven home and sat in the garden for 2 hours before he came inside and told me. He told me everything in the first conversation, not in stages, not managed and parceled out to protect me from the weight of it. Everything. The diagnosis, the prognosis, what the treatment options were and what they were realistically likely to achieve, and what he thought the next year was going to look like and what he wanted to do with it. He was 36 years old and he had 8 months to a year, and he sat at the kitchen table and told me all of it with the specific honesty of someone who had decided that the most loving thing he could do in that moment was not protect me from the truth. I loved him for that more than almost anything else he ever did, and he did a great many things worth loving. James's father Edward had built the company that James had left at 24 to start his own. Edward Holt Sr. had run Holt Manufacturing for 31 years, a mid-sized industrial components business that was profitable and respected, and that Edward had always assumed James would eventually return to lead. When James left to start his own company, Edward had taken it personally in the way that fathers sometimes take their children's independence personally, as a judgment rather than a direction. The wound had healed imperfectly and had been managed over the years with the specific care that imperfect healing requires. Edward was not a villain. I want to say that clearly because the story might suggest he was, and I do not think that is accurate. He was a man who had built something and had a clear vision of what came next and whose son had declined to be that next thing. He had loved James in the way that fathers love sons when their love is also partly expectation, which is to say completely and with a condition attached that was never fully named but was always present. He had been less certain about me from the beginning, not hostile, uncertain in the way of someone who is not sure where a person fits into the structure they have built in their mind. I was a graphic designer who ran a small studio, which Edward understood in the abstract but not in the specific, and his abstract understanding of it was that it was not the kind of career that produced the kind of financial stability his son had built, and that therefore the relationship had a particular weight distribution that he tracked carefully without being asked to. James understood this. He had named it, in the way he named most true things, without drama and without apology. He said his father kept a mental ledger on everyone, and that being in his father's life meant being in the ledger, and that the ledger was not unfair exactly, but that it was always running and it was worth knowing about. The 11 months between diagnosis and death were the most important of my life, not because of what we lost, though we lost everything that mattered, but because of what we did with the time. James had decided, in the first week after his diagnosis, that he was going to spend whatever time he had building the things he had been meaning to build and saying the things he had been meaning to say and leaving the record of his life as close to what he actually meant as he could make it. He was 36 years old, and he approached this project with the precision and patience that had built his company, which is to say he was very good at it. He called Grace, his estate attorney, 2 weeks after his diagnosis. He called her before he told most of his family. He told me this afterward, and I asked him why, and he said because the estate work was going to require the clearest version of himself and he wanted to do it before the medication affected his cognition. He was practical in this specific way, which sometimes looked like coldness from the outside and was actually the opposite of coldness. It was care organized into action. He spent 3 months with Grace building the estate structure. I was not involved in those meetings. He asked me once if I wanted to be, and I said I trusted him, and he said that was not quite the question, and I said I know, but it is my answer, and he nodded and went to the meetings alone and came home and we had dinner and talked about other things. Here's what I want to tell you about Edward during those 11 months. He came to the city 6 times. He was present in the way he was capable of being present, which was practically rather than emotionally. He arranged for a specialist in neuro-oncology to consult on James's case, which was a real and generous thing. He offered twice to help with finances, which were not a concern but which he did not know were not a concern because James had not told him about the company sale in full detail and I had not corrected his assumption. He sat with James on 2 long afternoons in the garden, and I do not know what they said because I gave them the privacy of it, and James told me only that they had talked about things they had not talked about before, which I understood to mean the imperfect healing and the ledger and the condition attached to the love. He also, in the 3rd month after the diagnosis, called Grace directly. I did not know this until Grace told me afterward, at the meeting where she walked me through the complete estate structure. She told me carefully, with the specific care of an attorney who is relaying information she knows is significant, that Edward had contacted her office 3 months into James's illness and had asked to speak with her about the estate. She had told him she could not speak with him without James's consent. He had asked her to pass along a message to James, which was that he hoped James would consider including the family business in any bequest planning and that he was available to discuss it. Grace had passed the message to James. James had listened. He had not responded to his father through Grace. He had called his father directly, which Grace did not know the content of, and whatever was said in that call was between them. What James did in Grace's office in the weeks after that call was what I will describe to you now, because the description of it is the whole heart of this story. James had built, with Grace's assistance and over 3 months of careful legal work, a private foundation, not a large institutional operation, a working charitable foundation with a specific and narrow mission, funded by a significant portion of his estate, structured with professional governance, and established as a legal entity with a board and bylaws and the full formal architecture of a permanent organization. The foundation's mission was educational technology access for underserved communities. This was not random. James had grown up in a neighborhood where the school computers were shared between 3 classrooms and the internet connection was shared between 300 students, and he had spent his career building data systems and had thought for years about the specific gap between the infrastructure he built for well-funded organizations and the infrastructure that existed in the schools he had attended. He had talked about it with me. He had never done anything about it because the company had required everything. The diagnosis gave him the reason to stop waiting. He named the foundation. He funded it. He built the governance structure. He appointed an executive director, a woman named Priya Chen who had run a similar initiative for a national nonprofit and who James had called 6 months before his death and who had said yes within a week. And he named me as the foundation's chair, not as a beneficiary, not as an inheritor, as the chair of the board of a working philanthropic organization with a professional staff and a funded mission and a legal structure that was, by design, built to operate indefinitely. He also left me, in a separate personal bequest, the house we had shared and enough in liquid assets to live without financial pressure for the foreseeable future, and a letter that I keep in the drawer of my desk and read when I need to remember what I am doing and why. The remainder of his estate, after the foundation funding and my personal bequest, went to a combination of his employees through a profit-sharing structure he had arranged with Grace and to 2 charities he had supported for years. His father received nothing, not because James was angry at his father. James was not angry. The letter he had left for Edward, which Grace gave him at the will reading, made this clear. James had loved his father. He had seen him clearly. He had understood the ledger and the condition and the call to Grace and the message about the family business, and he had made his decisions about his estate with the full understanding of all of those things and without allowing them to make the decisions for him. I want to tell you about the document on the table in that conference room, the one Sylvia slid toward Edward and Gerald Marsh, because it was not the will. The will came after. The document on the table was a letter James had written to his father, sealed in an envelope with Edward's name on it in James's handwriting, with an instruction to Sylvia that it be given to him at the opening of the will reading. I did not know what was in the letter. I still do not know the full contents. Edward has never told me and I have never asked. What I know is that Edward read it in the conference room while Gerald Marsh sat beside him, and that when he finished reading it he set it down and he looked at the table for a long time and Gerald Marsh said something to him quietly and Edward shook his head. That was the only moment in the will reading that made me feel something other than the specific grief of watching a legal document convert 9 years of a life into a series of allocations. Have you ever watched someone receive a truth they had been avoiding for a long time and recognize it in a room full of people? Tell me in the comment. I read every one. And subscribe so you are here for the rest, because what happened after Edward put that letter down is the part that told me everything about who James had actually been building for all along. Sylvia opened the will. She read it in full, which is the formal practice, each bequest named and described in the specific legal language that translates a person's wishes into binding instructions. The foundation was described in full. My personal bequest was described. The employee profit-sharing structure was described. The charitable allocations were described. Gerald Marsh took notes throughout. Edward did not. When Sylvia finished reading, Gerald Marsh spoke. He said he had concerns about the capacity under which the will had been executed, given the nature of James's illness and the cognitive effects of the treatment he had received. He said he believed there were grounds for a capacity challenge and that his client intended to pursue that avenue if the terms of the will were not subject to negotiation. Sylvia looked at him. She said, "The will was executed 8 months ago, 3 months after the diagnosis, by an individual who was assessed by his treating neurologist on the date of signing as cognitively intact and fully oriented. The assessment is in the record. The capacity documentation is thorough." She paused. A capacity challenge in these circumstances would be expensive, time-consuming, and in my professional assessment, unsuccessful. But your client is of course entitled to pursue whatever legal remedies he believes are available. Gerald Marsh said he understood and that he would advise his client accordingly. Edward said nothing through any of this. He had put the letter in the inside pocket of his jacket after he finished reading it. He was looking at the table. I looked at him. This man who had kept a mental ledger on me for 9 years, who had called Grace's office and asked about the family business, who had driven 4 hours and brought a lawyer to his son's will reading, who was 69 years old and had just read a letter from his dead son in a conference room in January. I did not feel the thing I might have expected to feel. I had spent 11 months watching James build toward this day with the same precision he brought to everything, and the day was unfolding the way he had built it to unfold, and what I felt watching Edward read that letter and look at the table was something more complicated than satisfaction, something closer to the grief I had been carrying for 11 weeks but from a different angle. The grief of watching someone understand something too late. The grief of recognizing that the letter Edward was holding was James trying, one final time, with the only language he had left, to close the distance that the ledger had created. I do not know if it worked. I still do not know. Gerald Marsh and Edward left the conference room together 40 minutes after the reading began. Gerald Marsh had said 2 more things before they left. The first was that his client reserved the right to pursue legal remedies pending review of the documentation. The second was that his client would be in touch. Sylvia had said, "That is his prerogative." They left. Sylvia looked at me across the table. She said, "I want to tell you that James spent significant time on the capacity documentation specifically because he anticipated this. He was thorough. I have not seen more thorough estate documentation in 22 years. I said, "That sounds like him." She almost smiled. She said, "It does." I drove home. I sat in the house that was now entirely mine and I thought about 11 months of Sundays in the garden and what James had been doing in Grace's office all those afternoons and what he had been building and for whom. The capacity challenge never materialized. Gerald Marsh sent a letter to Grace's office 2 weeks after the will reading stating that after review of the documentation his client had determined not to pursue a formal challenge at this time. The language at this time was the language of someone leaving a door open that they had decided not to walk through. Grace filed the letter. She called me to tell me. She said, "I expected this. James expected this." I asked her what James had said about it. She said, "He said his father was a practical man and that practical men did not spend money on losing cases." She paused. "He also said something else. He said he hoped his father would read the letter and understand something he had been trying to say for a long time and that the legal challenge was less important to him than the letter." I sat with that for a moment. Edward called me 6 weeks after the will reading, not Gerald Marsh. Edward himself, on a Sunday afternoon, which I noticed. I answered because I had decided, in the weeks since the reading, that whatever the next chapter looked like I was not going to build it on avoidance. He said he had read the letter several times. I said said I was glad. He said, I did not understand what James had built, the company, what it was. I knew the outlines but I did not understand it. I said, he was very good at what he did. There was a pause. He said, he was better than I gave him credit for. He said it plainly, which from Edward was not nothing. I said, he knew that you respected him. He told me so. Edward said, I respected him. I am not sure I understood him. I said, he understood you. He wrote you a letter. Whatever is in it, it was him trying to make sure you knew he understood. Another pause. Longer. He said, the foundation. What does it do? I told him, the educational technology mission, Priya Chen and the staff, the schools they were working with, the specific gap between infrastructure and access that James had thought about for years and had finally built something to address. I told him about the first grant cycle, which had launched the previous month, and the 12 schools in 3 cities that were the first recipients. Edward listened to all of it. He asked 2 questions, both of them practical, which was who he was. He asked about the governance structure and about the reporting requirements for the board. I answered both. He said, James always understood governance. Even as a boy, he had that quality. I said, he did. He said, I would like to learn more about the foundation, if that would be appropriate. I said I thought it would be appropriate and that I would have Priya send him the annual report when it was published. He said thank you. We talked for 12 more minutes about James in the specific way that 2 people who both loved someone who is gone talk about them, comparing versions of the same person, finding the places where the versions overlap and the places where they are distinct. Edward told me something about James as a child that I had not known, a story about a science fair project and a stubbornness that had made Edward furious at the time and that Edward now described with the unmistakable tone of a man who has decided, in retrospect, that the stubbornness was a quality worth having. I told him something about James at the end, not about the illness, about a conversation we had had in the garden 2 weeks before he died when he had been very tired and the words had been slow but the thoughts had been clear, about what he hoped the foundation would eventually become and the specific schools he had thought about and the particular way he had described the kid in the 3rd row seat who could not load the page. Edward was quiet for a moment after that. He said, he thought about things like that. I said, always. We said goodbye. I set the phone on the kitchen table and looked at the window and at the garden where the climbing roses James had planted were dormant for winter and would be back in April. The foundation's first full year of operation has just concluded. Priya's report landed on my desk last week. 31 schools, 7 cities, 4,000 students with meaningful improvements in connectivity and device access. A wait list of 17 additional schools for the next grant cycle. A second round of funding from a corporate partner that James had anticipated might be interested and had mentioned to Priya before he died. He had been right about that too. I chair the board meetings on the 3rd Thursday of every month. I sit at the head of the table in the foundation's small office on the east side of the city and I run the meetings the way James ran everything, with precision and patience, asking the right questions and trusting the people around the table to have the right answers. Priya is extraordinary. The board is strong. The work is real. I also still run my design studio. The 2 things coexist the way James believed they would, which is to say without competition, because they are both mine and mine is a large enough category to hold more than one true thing. Edward came to the city in April. He did not call ahead with a lawyer. He called ahead with a reasonable amount of notice and asked if he could visit. I said yes. I showed him the foundation office. I introduced him to Priya, who was warm and professional and had known, because I had told her, something of the history without all of the details. He asked her the same 2 practical questions he had asked me on the phone and several additional ones that told me he had been thinking about it in the intervening month. Afterward we had lunch at a restaurant near the foundation office. He ordered coffee and did not look at the menu until I suggested a dish and he said that sounded fine. He was quieter than he had been at most of the family events I had attended over 9 years. Not sad exactly. The specific quietness of a man who is carrying something and has decided that carrying it is the appropriate response rather than setting it down. He said, over coffee, that he had told his company's board about the foundation, that he had suggested they consider a partnership in the next fiscal year, that the board had been receptive. I looked at him across the table. He said, James built something real. I would like it to matter to the people who carry his name. I said, I think he would have liked that. Edward nodded. He picked up the menu. He ordered the dish I had recommended. We finished lunch. At the door of the restaurant he shook my hand. Not a hug, which was not who he was. A handshake, firm and brief, the way he shook hands with people he respected. I walked back to the foundation office. I sat at my desk. I opened Priya's report again and looked at the numbers and thought about James in Grace's office 3 months after his diagnosis, building something with the precision and patience of a man who understood that the best structures are built for the person who will eventually stand inside them. He had built the foundation for the kids in the 3rd row seats who could not load the page. He had built the legal structure for me. He had written a letter for his father. And he had trusted, with the specific trust of someone who has done all the work that trust requires, that each of those things would find the person it was built for for and do what he had designed it to do. He was right. He was almost always right. I keep his letter in the desk drawer beside Priya's report and the first grant cycle results and a photograph from the garden the summer before his diagnosis. The three of us, James and me, and the climbing roses that were not yet established, that would take 2 more years to bloom, that are blooming now. He planted them knowing he would not see them fully grown. He planted them for the person who would be standing there when they were. I am standing there. That is my story. 1 briefcase in a conference room, 1 letter in an envelope, and a foundation built for the kid in the 3rd row seat who cannot load the page. If this stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the most permanent things are built quietly, in advance, by people who understand that love is a form of architecture. Drop a comment and tell me about something someone built for you that you only understood after the fact. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.